It was supposed to be a quiet Washington night in August 2001, until the waves carried back a single paintbrush, snapped in half, still sticky with red. The woman it belonged to, 25-year-old Evelyn Hartman, was gone. Vanished from the boat launch, where she'd gone to meet someone she trusted. For over 2 decades, her disappearance haunted the small town, whispers, guilt, and secrets buried beneath years of silence. But when detectives reopened the case, a forgotten cigarette, but a faded napkin, and a decades-old photograph blew everything wide open. The DNA led straight to a man everyone loved, the town's so-called Good Samaritan. And when he was arrested, neighbors didn't just see a killer, they saw the truth about themselves. Because someone else out there still knows what really happened that night, and they're not done watching. Before we dive deeper, hit subscribe and like for more cold cases and chilling mysteries. The town had learned to live around the absence. Washington was the kind of coastal place where everyone knew the rhythm of tides and the sound of someone's laughter drifting down Main Street. On summer nights, the boat launch smelled like diesel and fried dough. In the mornings, fishermen argued over who'd had the best catch. The absence, Evelyn Hartman's, was an indentation in that rhythm, noticeable only if you paused long enough to feel the hollow. Evelyn was 25 when she vanished in August 2001. She painted landscapes, worked part-time at a library, and collected postcards she never mailed. In old photographs, she tilted her head the way you tilt a radio dial, listening for something private. Her disappearance folded into the town's memory like a forgotten page. People told themselves she had left, been taken away, or simply become a story you told at the bar. Over time, the story hardened into a set of careful silences. Detective Jonah Morales knew that hard silences sometimes had soft edges. He'd spent years in units labeled cold case, where time had worn evidence thin but not erased it. He had a patient way of thinking, that if you found the right place to press, the past might cough up what it had swallowed. His partner, Lila Reed, was a database whisperer. She could coax sense from scattered details. Together, they were an insistence more than a thunderbolt. The case returned to Jonah on a wet morning when an archivist in a renovated courthouse opened a box and found a brittle napkin tucked between tax receipts. It smelled faintly of tobacco and salt. Someone had written on it, in the quick slanted hand of someone making a reminder, "Boat launch 9 p.m. Beside it was a yellow dentist receipt stamped August 2nd, 2001, E. Hartman. It was the kind of tiny human thing that had been missed when the world was noisier. Jonah felt the old electrical hum in his chest. Curiosity harnessed into authority. They pulled the file. Photographs, witness statements, ragged hopes. 2 decades had muddled faces, but not the essentials. Witnesses had said they'd seen a white pickup at the launch that night. Others remembered a pair of boot prints in the sand. Nothing had linked those details together, and the town's need for a neat story had let them grow cold. Jonah and Lila followed the crumb trail the napkin suggested. The dentist's records, archived in a different county, matched the name. The receipt's purchase of a small tube of pain relief gel led them to a clerk who remembered a woman with paint on her hands. The clerk recalled that week being busy, fairs, festivals. Small memories accrete into a map if someone has the patience to lay them out. One name kept reappearing in the margins, Roger Hale. He was a contractor who had lived in town since the 80s. He drove a white pickup, sponsored youth teams, and kept a weathered shed where he worked late into the night. To many he was ordinary in the way a weathered house is ordinary. Familiar, dependable, cluttered with a history of small mistakes. He'd once been seen near the boat launch. He stoked bonfires near the marina. He had a temper you could not call violent, but which sometimes shaped the way he moved. The evidence that pinned him, months later, when technology gave investigators something that had not existed in 2001, wasn't cinematic. A cigarette, but collected by a teenager after a bonfire in 2001, had been preserved by a friend who never threw anything away. Advances in genetic genealogy linked a partial profile from that, but to a relative of Roger's. Hair fibers found in a 10-year-old locker, re-examined with modern techniques, matched Evelyn. Jonah thought of evidence as a conversation between objects and time. The objects were patient. Sometimes time was the one who fumbled. They arrested Roger on a Tuesday. He stood in his workshop, his hands grease-stained, and listened to the charges as if the words had little purchase. His neighbors gathered and watched like people in a theater who were certain the plot would not include someone they knew. News vans arrived with the urgency of a wave. The community bristled in different directions: shock, denial, a sudden eagerness to sort itself into camps. Roger's defense argued coincidence, cross-contamination, and a town's rush to closure. The prosecution presented the chain of custody, the genealogical link, and a faded napkin and receipt that anchored Evelyn in the hours before she vanished. There was no single smoking gun. There was a constellation of small proofs that, taken together, cast a long shadow across Roger's life. Evelyn's mother, Evelyn Hartman, moved through the courtroom like someone carrying light and the ache of weight. She had aged into the kind of person who kept every postcard her daughter had ever bought and knew the name of every one of Evelyn's paintbrushes. When she spoke, her voice was a quiet plane cutting through static. "I want to know who took her," she said, "and why it was hidden under years." Neighbors, however, did what neighbors do. They tried to sort themselves. Some insisted Roger was innocent because they'd seen him fix a roof for free. Others felt vindicated, as if a verdict had smoothed one jagged piece of the town. The argument was not about facts alone. It was about whether the town could accept that one of its own might be capable of something monstrous. When the jury returned a guilty verdict, the sound was both final and incomplete. Some cried openly. Others walked away with the hunch of hands in their pockets. Marianne wept with a small, animal sob that left the courtroom hush. Roger's face did not change. He strode from the stand with the flatness of a man who had been found insufficient. Yet conviction was not closure. It is a word that fills a space in the record. It does not always satisfy the living's need for why. Jonah watched the town rearrange itself. People found fault lines they had not known were there. Friendships that had been comfortable now frayed. There were apologies that read like first drafts, awkward, earnest, and incomplete. After the trial, Marianne received a photograph in the mail with no return address. It was Evelyn on the dock, hair loose, a smudge of paint on her thumb, a crescent bruise near her knuckle. On the back, in a short, neat hand, someone had written, "Don't stop looking." Marianne carried the picture like a talisman. The note multiplied the question that the courtroom could not answer. Had everyone told everything? The community found it hard to settle. Roger's conviction had given some answers, but opened other doors. A neighbor who had once joked about boys' pranks confessed to a late-night scheme years ago that involved moving a small boat and a tarp. An old logger produced a diary with initials that hinted at a group who had known one another's secrets and kept a ledger of their jokes. Such confessions were small at first, an ember of guilt here, a tremor of memory there. But together they suggested that the night Evelyn disappeared had been more crowded with people and choices than any single verdict could account for. Jonah returned to the files, not because he doubted the verdict, but because he believed truth was layered. The shoebox of photographs Marianne had kept contained more than evidence. It held arguments, moments, and gestures. He listened to a cassette they'd found, Evelyn's voice, laughing, then a soft sentence. "If anyone hears this, tell Mom I love the light on the water." The tape ended with a sound of fabric scraping, like canvas being folded. That same week, at Marianne's kitchen table, women who had known Evelyn met to remember rather than accuse. They made tea, shared postcards, and read from the artist's journals. These gatherings were not about prosecution. They were about naming a life. Marianne wanted the town to remember Evelyn as more than a file. She wanted her daughter to be a person who painted the light instead of a cold case label. As the memory gatherings grew, Jonah found himself hearing new names and receiving anonymous notes. One read simply, "It wasn't only him." Another contained a scrap of fabric that matched a jacket in one of Evelyn's photographs. Each crumb raised the possibility that the town's silence had been shared and that the conviction, while just, might have captured only one strand in a larger weave. The note, "It wasn't only him," became a hinge. Some read it as a conspiracy theory. Others read it as a summons. For Jonah, it was a practical prompt. He retraced the nights, re-interviewed old witnesses, and checked timelines against alibis. The new evidence didn't erase the forensic links, but it did suggest there might have been accomplices or enablers, people who had seen, passed by, or chosen not to speak. His work had human results. A teenager who had carried a canvas for years came forward and said the group had joked about hiding a painting. He had not realized then that it might have been Evelyn's. A woman who'd once dated Roger said she had turned away when she thought she'd seen something suspicious because she believed, like many, that trouble didn't come from the familiar. Admission is slow. It demands that people accept a brittle view of themselves. The town's daily life adjusted. People installed lights at the boat launch, and parents double-checked where their children played. A bench by the river was painted with Evelyn's name, and local artists donated time to restore her canvases for a small exhibit. These acts had the urgent softness of a community trying to heal with gestures more than laws. But there was resistance too. Some pushed back, accusing Jonah of reopening wounds for the sake of his ego or for a headline. Others felt the changes would stain the town's reputation. Jonah took the criticism in the same way he received notes. He cataloged them and then moved on. He relied on the facts he had and the people who slowly, awkwardly, chose to speak. Months later, when the shoebox gave up its small secrets and the locker produced its letter, Jonah found himself facing a moral knot. The letter's initials could not, by themselves, produce prosecutions. Memory decays. Witnesses are gone. Yet the moral clarity of the town had shifted. People who had once laughed away the idea of being specialized in oversight now felt the weight of their small choices. It was in that liminal space, between conviction and the messy reveal of community culpability, that the note, "It wasn't only him," began to feel like an invitation rather than an accusation. Who had written it? Someone who wanted the truth, or someone who wanted to stir town gossip? Jonah suspected the former. He thought like a man who had learned that confession is messy but often necessary. The deeper he dug, the more he saw how memory and choice intersect. One neighbor, who had once been an adolescent in 2001, admitted in tears that he and his friends had dared each other to do things that night because bravado felt like belonging. They had laughed, then panicked when they heard a sound that could have been a life changing into death. The fear they felt had been the same kind that breeds silence, a fear of punishment, of shame, of being the one who broke the group's impossible rules. As for Roger, the trial did not depict him as a cartoon villain. Witnesses spoke of him fixing fences, teaching a boy to swing a hammer, and giving a woman a ride when her car stalled. The truth of human complexity was unavoidable. People could be kind and also complicit. A life could contain both charity and violence. The juror's job was to weigh evidence, not to tame the morality that rested with each local heart. By the time Jonah wrote the new list, his handwriting had steadied. He included names, dates, and small instructions. Re-interview, check ledgers, look for old photographs that might have lived in attics. He wrote, find the author of the Don't Stop Looking photograph, and beneath it, return to the river at dawn with Marianne. When he returned at dawn, Marianne met him with a thermos of coffee and a paint-stained sweater. They sat and watched the light wash the river, and for a moment the past and present seemed to hold the same space. The bench by the boat launch held flowers laid there last week by teenagers who had read about the case and decided to do something. Marianne handed Jonah a postcard Evelyn had written to no one, a small watercolor of twilight. Jonah understood then that the work was not only to put names in a ledger. It was to keep a person alive in the ways a town could, on a bench, in a painting, in the practice of telling the truth out loud. The work would go on. There would be subpoenas and more letters, generous apologies and bitter denials. Jonah had learned that the truth is not always a single dramatic reveal. Sometimes it is a long, stubborn accumulation of small confessions and careful listening. He had also learned that the people who stayed were the ones who wanted to be better. And yet the most unsettling thing of all was not the possibility of more names, but the sense that someone was still watching the case close and open again. The photograph of the key, the unmarked envelopes, the timing of the notes, all suggested a mind that mapped the town's nerves. That mind might be guilty in the strict sense, or it might be a conscience finally moved to action. Either way, it meant there were edges to the story Jonah had not yet seen. He added another item to his list: find who watches. Then he packed the shoebox again, put the tape back in its case, and left the files open on his dining table. The river outside kept its own counsel. The town, for now, had an answer and a question. Jonah taped the list back into the file the way a surgeon retapes a wound. Careful, precise, conscious that however tidy the surface looked, the scar beneath might still throb. Find who watches. The words sat like a demand rather than an instruction. He slept poorly that week, short, watchful sleep that kept replaying corners of the town like a film strip. When he woke, the world always seemed slightly out of phase, as if some day had been edited out of the reel. He shared the note with Lila in the morning light of a cold case office. She tapped a pen against her lip and scrolled through the digital copies of evidence, like someone searching for a face in a crowd. It's not just sentiment, she said. Someone is tying threads together and delivering them where Marianne will find them. Whoever wrote, "Don't stop looking," knew this stuff would get Marianne's attention. Whoever wrote, "It wasn't only him," meant it to get you moving. These aren't casual notes. Jonah nodded. The question is motive. Who would want the truth, dangerous as it might be, or who would want old wounds reopened? Lila pointed at a set of postmarks from the envelopes they'd kept. They look hand-delivered, no postmark. Whoever's doing this doesn't want a trace through the post office. They began to think differently. Watchers didn't always observe from bald rooftops. Watchers sometimes walked the sidewalk with a paper bag of groceries, or they were the person who handed out flyers and then lingered too long. They could be someone who had kept a secret and now wanted the shape of it to be seen. Marianne received the next package at dawn. It arrived just as she was opening the blinds. 2 photographs slid between the panes of light. Evelyn in one at a summer fair, hair braided, face flushed, a ribbon caught in sunlight. In the second, a different shot, Evelyn at the launch, looking toward the water, as if someone had taken the picture from behind a stack of crates. The second photograph had something else, a thumbprint pressed into the emulsion, faint but visible under a magnifying glass. Jonah sat with Marianne in her kitchen, the morning like a gray ocean beyond the window. She held the photograph in both hands, turning it so the light fell differently. "Do you know that thumb?" Jonah asked gently. She studied it the way she did a painting she could not yet name. "No, but you can see how careful the person was. They took pictures she would have liked. They watched because they loved what she made. Or they watched because they wanted her." The possibility landed between them with the weight of stone. Lila ran the photograph under the lab's high-resolution scanner. The image yielded what small technical tools could: microscopic fibers, dust patterns, and the residue that suggested the photograph had been stored inside a leather wallet. The thumbprint was smudged but present. Fingerprint databases of local records were sparse for the era, but Lila worked through municipal returning records, volunteer rosters, registered gun permits, local clubs. Name after name dropped away. But then she hit a partial match, an old volunteer list from the Marina Association. The print matched in part to a record on file for a man named Daniel Price, born 1969, formerly employed at the state docks. Daniel Price had been one of those men who fit into the town's background. He was tall, mild-mannered, known for tournament wins at the annual base derby, and rarely the subject of gossip. He was also, according to an old Marina ledger, on duty the night Evelyn disappeared. The ledger entry was handwritten and smudged: Price, Patrol 2100. It placed him near the launch. Jonah's stomach tightened. We missed him in 2001. Either we missed him, or he moved carefully enough to leave only the smallest prints. Or the town let smallness stand for innocence. They visited Daniel at his modest house on the edge of town. He was quiet in the way of men who have made their lives out of steady hands. He welcomed them in, offered them coffee, and said he remembered the summer of 2001 like it had been a long, warm ache. "I remember the fireworks," he said, "and the repair job on the pier. Evelyn used to come by sometimes to set up little shows of her paintings. Lovely girl. Quiet. She liked the light on the pylons. Jonah watched him carefully. Were you at the launch on August 2nd? Daniel's face tightened. I made a round. I filled a clipboard. I checked lanterns. Someone left a cigarette in the sand, and I logged it. He blinked, like the words frightened him. I remember thinking it might have been kids. They were drinking a little. I didn't think to call it in. He stopped. He folded his hands as if to hold himself together. Did you see anyone else? A white pickup. Daniel's mouth worked. Maybe. A blur. A white pickup. Hale had won. People were moving all over. Boats. Folks laughing. I was watching the harbor lights more than anything. I don't want anyone to think, he swallowed. I did not touch her. I swear. Jonah believed at least part of the man's fear. It was the right kind of fear for someone who had been present and then left a life unchanged. Sometimes the people who stuck around were the ones who saw small things and did nothing. They lived with a memory like a pebble in their shoe. Always there. Back at the office, Lila cross-referenced Daniel's handwriting in the marina logs with his signature on a 2002 boating license renewal. The loops matched. The pressure was similar. But handwriting wasn't enough. They needed more. A quiet breakthrough came from an unlikely place, the town's library archive. An older librarian, a woman named Grace who had outlasted many town councils, had kept a ledger that recorded volunteer schedules for 20 years. Jonah found the ledger hidden under a stack of lease agreements. In the margin that night was a note. Price, checked lanterns, 2,105, boat moved, tarp, H. Hale. Beneath that was another shorthand. E. Hartman, painted bench. Someone in town, long ago, had tried to write the night down. The attempt had been imperfect, partial, an attempt to catch the ghost of a memory. But the ledger placed Daniel near an event, boat move, tarp, that matched the later confession of a neighbor who admitted to moving a tarp as a prank. The ledger suggested more than one pair of hands at the launch that night. Jonah's team turned those angles into questions. They interviewed the neighbor who had admitted the prank again. His story shifted when faced with the ledger. He remembered the tarp more clearly. He remembered a murmured argument, the flash of a figure bending near the water, the scent of paint that didn't belong. He named another participant who had been laughing then gone, a name Jonah had seen before, belonging to a man who had recently died in another county. The dead man's widow, now frail and guarded, refused to talk. While Jonah and Lila dug through the town's physical memory, Marianne pursued another trail, one of tenderness. She met other women who had known Evelyn, students, fellow library workers, women who had sat for portraits. They told Marianne stories that had never been spoken aloud. Evelyn's habit of sketching people at the market, the way she would leave tiny folded paintings in strangers' pockets with notes like, "For when you miss the light." Marianne gathered the paintings, restoring them with a reverence that looked like prayer. One night, an envelope arrived on Marianne's porch after she had returned from a vigil. Inside was a small scrap of canvas with a fingerprint of paint. On the back, in a child's cursive, was a name, T. Mallory. Marianne did not know the name, but she did not have to ask Jonah to read the significance. Every name was a doorway now. T. Mallory turned out to be Thomas Mallory, a high school teacher who had coached the town's baseball team in 2001. He had an old photograph album, a faded snapshot of a barbecue where Evelyn smiled with people whose faces Jonah recognized. In the photo, Evelyn stood near a man whose shape Jonah had seen in witness statements but never followed up on, a man who taught woodshop, who drove a truck that sometimes smelled of old newspapers. Mallory's face reddened with embarrassment when Jonah showed him the image. "That man, he used to come by the lunchroom," Mallory said. "He talked about boats like they were women. He had a temper. But you can't blame a man for having a temper. Not everything from a man with a temper is a calf of a crime." "Still," he faltered, "I remember him being there that night. He liked to carry big tools and sing off-key. Names multiplied like a rash. Each one was not necessarily guilty, but each one loosened a thread. If the town was a tapestry, it was becoming clear the pattern of Evelyn's disappearance ran through familiar, ordinary spaces. volunteer rosters, team lists, neighborhood bonfires. Those were the places where predation could hide in plain sight, where a person could be accepted because the community valued the services they provided. Then Jonah received the first real threat. It came in the night, folded into a plain white envelope left under the office door. Inside was a single sentence, typed on an old manual typewriter. "Stop digging. Detective Morales." Some stories are paid for twice, once with lives, once with tongues. Leave them buried. The typewriter's font was uneven. Lila traced the indentation left on the paper. Older typefaces had idiosyncrasies. An obsessive finger could sometimes be identified by the way it hit the keys. They took the paper to a forensic lab in the neighboring county. The lab could not identify a specific typewriter, but it did find particles consistent with printer's ink and a residue that suggested the typeface had been applied with an old ribbon. "Someone wants to scare you," Lila said, her voice low. "Or someone who left the note thinks they can scare us." Jonah folded the note like a map. He had expected the work to unsettle people. He had not expected a direct warning aimed at him. He thought of Marianne receiving anonymous packages, of the finger on Evelyn's photograph, of notes that wanted someone to look. He thought of the human reluctance to trade comfort for truth. He felt both the pulse of danger and the stubbornness that had led him here. He did not stop. Instead, he changed tactics. He met with local clergy, with retired judges, with a few old-timers who still considered themselves more town stewards than politicians. He asked for their help, not to prosecute, but to hear stories. People who had been silent for 2 decades sometimes needed the right audience to speak. Jonah arranged small meetings in living rooms and kitchens, not interrogation rooms. He believed confession often flinched from courtroom light and sought the softer warming of shared tea. At one such meeting, an elderly man named Calvin, who had once been a harbor master, came forward with something he had hidden for years. An old logbook he had taken from the docks before the county auctioned some equipment in 2003. Calvin had been saving the book in his attic, a relic he couldn't bear to throw away. The log, pages scrawled with names, times, and the occasional terse remark, contained something that made Jonah's throat go dry. On August 2nd, 2001, 3 entries clustered close together. They read in Calvin's sprawling hand: 2100, Hartman painting bench, 2110, Hale left with pickup, 2115, Unk voice/men, 2130, canvas moved with tarp. Someone had tried to put the night into order then, and someone had tried to keep it from being orderly. The logbook also included a small, painstakingly penciled note in the margin: "Watchers don't always watch. Sometimes they write." The log's existence was proof that not everyone had been silent. Someone, Calvin, had tried to preserve the chronology. But the log also suggested a crowd had been present, multiple men, multiple small actions, decisions that compiled into a single catastrophic absence. The revelations spread like a tide. Witnesses who had once described the night as fuzzy now remembered details with the clarity of relief. A man who had been a teenager then admitted he had been dared to move a small skiff and had seen a man arguing with Evelyn. He had not told because he feared becoming the scapegoat for whatever happened. Another man, who worked nights at the marina then, confessed to having later burned a small canvas he found by the jetty, not because he knew its significance, but because he feared being implicated in something he didn't understand. These confessions did not exonerate or condemn in entirety. They were partial truths, shards of a larger mirror, but they shifted the balance of memory toward admission. The town, slow and reluctant, was beginning to speak. Then came a piece of evidence that made everything more pointed: a storage unit key. It arrived in Marianne's mailbox on a rain-swept morning with no return address. A small brass key, dated 2019 at its base, and a typed slip of paper that read, Unit 12 Harbor Storage. Jonah's fingers closed around the key like a cold coin. He checked the storage facility's public ledger. Unit 12 had been rented in 2002 by a man named Harold Jennings, a local who had since moved away and whose records contained a forwarding address in a nearby city. Jennings had served on committees, had a habit of giving money to town causes, and a laugh that betrayed a lifetime of easy nights. He was not a man the town had suspected. Jonah drove to the storage facility. The manager, a woman named Rosa, remembered Jennings. He had rented the unit after the 2001 fair, she said, then stopped paying in 2005. The unit had been auctioned, and its contents spread to another facility. We keep records, Rosa said, flipping through a ledger. But sometimes people change names. Or dates. Units move. The key could be a plant. It could be a red herring. It could be the finest thread Jonah had yet found. Whoever had left it had done so anonymously and with a risk attached. Sending someone to a storage unit meant directing their attention toward a place that could hold physical things, photos, papers, objects, items that dated and lasted. Jonah checked Marianne's porch camera. Unlikely, but Marianne had installed one after the arrest, and saw a shadow folding something into the mailbox 2 nights before. The shadow's gait suggested someone younger, perhaps the same teenager who had conserved the cigarette but for 20 years. But the shadow was only a suggestion. Whoever the watcher was, they preferred distance. Jonah and Lila drove to the unit address at dusk. The facility smelled of damp concrete and old cardboard, the kind of smell that stores things people cannot bear to toss. The keypad clicked and the lights hummed. They found Unit 12 with its rusted door and the faint label that read 12 in flaking paint. Jonah slid the key into the lock. It turned with a whisper. He felt the shape of the room before he saw it. The tang of old varnish, the metallic bite of stored tools, the ghost weight of items packed carefully, as if someone had known they would be opened someday. A single bare bulb lit the unit with a yellow heart. Boxes were stacked along one wall. Canvas leaned against a crate. A sweatshirt, faded, with a patch that read Marina Volunteers, hung on a nail. And then, leaning against the far wall, was a wooden crate with Evelyn's initials carved into the lid. Jonah's hands found the crate like memory finding a knot. He had expected something, photos, perhaps, or manuscripts. But a crate with initials was a lockbox of intimacy. Lila looked at him, her face a soft steel. If this is what it looks like, someone has been keeping a life while the town slept. They pried the crate open. Inside lay a stack of canvases wrapped in oilcloth, 2 notebooks bound in twine, and a small, battered leather pouch. Jonah reached for the pouch and found, with his thumb, a ribbon of hair bound with a town fair ticket. It was Evelyn's handwriting on the ticket stub, an address scribbled in the corner, unfamiliar. The unit had been a shrine, a safe-keeping place for a life that bent toward preservation. Marianne had cried when Jonah called. "Keep it safe," she said, voice breaking as if she feared the air could steal everything in a careless breath. They catalogued the contents and brought them back to the station. The notebooks were Evelyn's, pages of sketches, notes about people, little lists, blue boat dented, H laughs too loud, T has bandage on thumb. The list read like someone trying to name the edges of danger. There was another note, almost a prayer. "If someone reads this, tell my mother I didn't leave." The leather pouch contained a thin silver chain and a locket. Inside the locket was a single photograph, Evelyn and a man Jonah did not recognize, standing too close. The man had a scar at the junction of his hairline and a mole at his jaw. He looked ordinary and private, the kind of portrait that could belong to a cousin or a lover. Jonah photographed everything and fed it into the case management system, like placing lit candles into a dark room. As they catalogued, Lila's phone buzzed. It was an anonymous message, a photo of a mailbox from across the town, its flag down. In the foreground, a pair of boots, one with a scuff, stood there. The message had no words. Jonah swallowed the rising heat of anger. Someone was orchestrating the slow reveal. Someone wanted the town to reopen, to find the wound and let the light in. Or someone wanted to watch the town contort in pain. The difference was as significant as a razor. He locked the crate away in the evidence room and walked outside into the fog that had rolled off the water. The harbor lights looked like small carved stars. The town moved in soft, determined gestures, a couple with coffee, a teenager on a skateboard. Each person was a witness in the making. Each had choices to live with. That evening, as Jonah returned to his car, his phone rang. The call was from a blocked number. He let it go to voicemail, the way you sometimes do when you want the record but not the interruption. When he listened, a distorted voice whispered into the gray hiss, "You should have left it buried." Then another voice, clearer, older, spoke, and Jonah heard the exact cadence of a man who had lived his life near water. "You are close. Be careful. They watch in daylight and in sleep. Not all watchers are friends." The call ended with the static of a line cut. Jonah stood in the cold and felt the town around him tilt. The watcher had become an actor. The town had become a stage. Whether the play would close on truth or rupture on vengeance was something he could not yet say. He drove home with the crate's contents blazing behind his eyes. Mary Ann's words about keeping Evelyn alive through paintings whispered in his ear. He thought of the notebook line, "If someone reads this, tell my mother I didn't leave." And he thought of the man in the locket, the scar at his hairline. He thought of the key, of the anonymous hand that had guided him to Unit 12. He thought of all the small failings that had allowed a life to slip from view, the laughter that quieted a warning, the joke that silenced a cry, the night that everyone believed was ordinary. At his front door, Jonah paused. The night moved like a slow animal about the town. He fumbled for his keys and found, in his pocket, a small scrap of paper folded into eighths. He had not noticed it before. On it was written a single word in a cramped hand he did not recognize. "Look." Underneath the word was an address, one that had not been on any of his lists. It was an address on the edge of town, a house with peeling paint and a yard crowded with children's toys. The address belonged to someone Jonah had seen in photos but had never visited. The man with the scar, the man in the locket. He felt the familiar pivot of the story, the moment when a path divides. Part of him wanted to go there now, to step into a house and demand answers in the moonlight. Part of him knew that answers often came with complications, sealed doors, sworn silence, and sometimes threats that could not be ignored. He made a decision. He would go in the morning. He would do it with a warrant if necessary. He would not be reckless. But there was something in him that had no patience for waiting. Someone had taken the measure of the town's slumber and had started to wake it. Jonah turned the key in his lock and, for the first time in weeks, allowed himself to think of Evelyn painting on the riverbank as dawn touched the water. He placed his hand on the notebook they'd taken from the crate and read, out loud to no one, the line she had written, "Tell my mother I didn't leave." The word "look" on the scrap of paper folded in his pocket felt like a command and a promise. He would look. He would ask. He would try to stitch back the edges of a life that had been unraveled. He would do it while it was still possible to find the hands that had done the unraveling. He slept with a lamp on that night and dreamt of a dock stretching into a black sea. Someone moved at the far edge, and when he blinked, the figure had turned. It had the scar at the temple. It smiled like a man who had kept a secret too long. In the morning, Jonah called Mary Ann. He told her they had more to examine and more people to speak with. Her voice was steady. "Find who watches," she said, echoing the sentence Jonah had written in his own hand. He thought of the many watchers in the town, the mother who watched a child play, the clerk who watched a ledger, the teenager who watched a cigarette go out in the sand. One of them, he suspected, had crossed the line from watching to deciding, writing notes and leaving keys to guide the search. Another watched to keep secrets. The line between watchers and actors had blurred. Jonah drove to the address on the scrap. He arrived as the morning fog lifted off the harbor, and the town took on the clean face of a new day. The house at the address was half hidden by a willow. Children's drawings were taped to the window. Sons with crooked cheeks, boats with lopsided sails. A woman stepped onto the porch, wiping her hands on a towel. She looked up as Jonah parked and exhaled, an expression of someone who had expected, at any moment, this door would be knocked upon. Jonah walked up the path, his badge discreet, his voice even. He had learned that gentleness sometimes unlatched the tightest lips. "Mr. Jennings?" he called, though the name on the mailbox was different. A man appeared at the doorway. The jawline Jonah had seen in the locket photograph. The scar was there, the mole, and the eyes that watched with a fatigue that was almost an apology. He looked at Jonah, as if he had been waiting for him to come. "You've been watching a long time," the man said softly. Jonah folded his hands in front of him. "We all have. We're trying to make the watching mean something." The man nodded, and in the tilt of his head Jonah saw a man who had held his breath for years. "Are you Harold Jennings?" Jonah asked. "People call me Harold. Most days I'm just Tom now." The man offered a thin smile. "I suppose you're here because someone sent you a key." Jonah did not answer with an accusation. "We found a crate with Evelyn's initials in a storage unit. We found her notebooks. We found a locket. We found a string of names. We have questions. Many of them." Tom's hands trembled just enough for Jonah to see they were not the hands of a man who felt innocent in the way courageless men pretend. They were the hands of someone carrying a small heat of guilt or knowledge, or both. "Come inside," Tom said. "If we're going to trade memories, it should be over coffee." Jonah followed him in. The house smelled of lemon cleaner and old varnish. The children's drawings fluttered in the window light. On the mantel sat a small wooden boat with Evelyn's name carved into its stern. Tom looked at it and then at Jonah. "I knew Evelyn," he said simply. "I knew her like I knew the tide. Sometimes you're there, and sometimes the water takes you away." He paused as if contemplating the right shape of a confession. "I didn't take her," he said, "but I watched the night. And I kept a ledger of the watching because I couldn't bear to hang the memory on nothing." Jonah felt something shift. "Tell me everything you know." Tom inhaled, then began. He would not give all of it at once. He told the small things first: the bonfires, the boat that wouldn't start, Evelyn's laughter, the way a tarp had been moved as a joke. Then he spoke of the argument near the water, and a man who had been too close. He told of a canvas wrapped in oilcloth that had been secreted away because whoever had hidden it thought it safer locked than burned. He told of nights he had kept vigil from the docks, watching for lights in the water, whispering apologies to the dark. He told of a list of people who had been there. At the end of his telling, Tom reached for a photograph from a small stack beside him. He handed it to Jonah. It showed Evelyn at the launch, framed by the pylons, and beside her, half obscured, a man Jonah had not yet been able to name. Tom pointed to the corner of the photo. "I took this," he said. "I put it away because I thought remembering would be like opening a wound. But wounds sometimes heal wrong unless you put a doctor to them." Jonah studied the photograph as if it were an X-ray. The man beside Evelyn had his face mostly turned away, but the angle of his jaw, the cut of his collar. Jonah thought of a scar, of the man with the mole, of Tom Jennings. The photograph was another hinge. Tom's voice lowered. "I didn't put the crate in storage," he said. "I helped keep it safe for a while. But someone else moved it later. Someone who knew where to hide things until people forgot to look." The confession settled between them. It was a small, human one. Admission of complicity by a kind that often results from fear, love, or the belief that secrecy protects the living. Jonah asked for more. Tom told him there had been talk among men that summer, talk that passed like a disease in the night. Men said things that later read like the rehearsal of a crime. They joked in ways that later stiffened into something monstrous when the laughter died. As Tom spoke, the phone in Jonah's pocket vibrated. He read the text and felt the floor tilt beneath his feet. "Stop now, or the watching will look back." The watcher, whoever they were, had moved from whisper to demand. The town's slow confession had disturbed a different kind of silence, one that protected the guilty and viewed truth as a trespass. Jonah looked at Tom and then at the photograph, and the two of them were suddenly very small in a house that had kept secrets for 2 decades. The walls seemed to hum with the collected weight of things unsaid. "This doesn't end here," Jonah said. "But you did the right thing." Tom's face crumpled in a private relief and in pain. "Am I safe?" he asked, the question of a man who had traded his ease for candor. Jonah did not promise safety. He promised process and presence. "We'll do this carefully. We'll ask questions, take statements. If anyone is to be charged, it will be because the evidence says so, not because someone is angry." Tom nodded. Then find who watches, he said, the phrase an urgent benediction. Jonah left Tom's house with another list in his head. The watchers had multiplied. Some wanted the truth known, others wanted the truth buried. The crate in Unit 12 had been a hinge. Tom's photograph was another. Each piece fit into the larger shape, a night that had been filled with many hands and many small cruelties. He drove back into town with the spring of action in his step and the heaviness of consequence in his chest. He had more than suspicion now. He had names, ledger entries, items tied to Evelyn's life, and a trail that led through the ordinary places where cruelty had nested. At the edge of town, by the boat launch where the pylons dipped into slow shoals of shadow, a single figure watched him pass. Jonah slowed the car. The silhouette looked like a man or a woman folded in a coat, stationary as a sentinel. For a moment Jonah thought the watcher might lift a hand and wave, as if to say, "Well done," or "Now stop." Instead, the figure stepped back into the dark and vanished behind the bench painted with Evelyn's name. Jonah felt the cold press of the case around him like a hand. He realized that the watcher had been a presence long before a note or a key, a presence in the town's conscience. Now the watcher had become an agent, directing him towards storage units and photographs, and sending warnings that tightened like a noose. He drove home with the knowledge that the story was not nearing an end, but entering a new, risk-laced chapter. He had what he needed to move forward: evidence, witnesses, a man who had kept a crate, a photograph that showed Evelyn with someone near the water. He also had a threat and the feeling of being observed. That night Jonah sat at his kitchen table with a coffee grown cold. On the table lay the Lockett photograph, the scrap with the word "look," and a list of names he had scribbled into the margins of the crate's inventory. He circled one name, then another. He whispered Evelyn's name aloud until it sounded like a small bell in an empty room. There was no neatness left in this work. There were only choices: to follow the watcher into the dark or to let the town sleep and let an absence calcify into myth. Jonah set his jaw and, for the first time since the case had reopened, felt a clarity that was as electric as it was terrible. He picked up the phone and dialed Lila. "Tomorrow," he said simply. "We start with photographs, then go to Tom's list. We pull the marina logs, and we file for another warrant if we have to. And call Marianne. She needs to know it's not only guilt that's moving through the town. It's also maybe danger." Lila's reply was immediate and sharp. "I'll be there. We'll ask who watches and who acts." They hung up and let the night pull toward dawn. Outside, the harbor lights flickered like a slow pulse. The watcher, whoever they were, had shown a pattern. Someone had kept Evelyn's things safe. Someone else had watched that person and decided what the town could bear. Jonah reached for the small brass key he had kept in his hand since the storage unit. He turned it over, feeling its cold. It fit into a pocket like a promise and a warning. He thought of Evelyn's line again, "Tell my mother I didn't leave." He resolved that he would not let that plea remain a secret between the living and the dead. At the window the night loosened, and the first thin line of morning cut the water. Jonah looked at the harbor and whispered, not to anyone but to the place itself, "Find who watches." Behind his words the town woke, like a tide turning. Somewhere, someone moved. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and turn on the notification bell, so you stay updated with mystery stories that strike a chord. Thanks for watching.